We Presbyterians may be the only ones left who, when we say the Lord's Prayer, we say it the way it is actually recorded in the Bible in the Gospel of Matthew. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Most other English language traditions, of course, use the term trespasses and those who trespass against us. But the metaphor of sin as a debt is so deeply rooted in the Bible and in the Old Testament that we cannot underestimate its importance in shaping the church's understanding of the nature of sin. For better and for worse, the debt metaphor has shaped our understanding of sin right up to today. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Friday, March 1st, 2024. Gary Anderson, an Old Testament scholar from the University of Notre Dame, has written an excellent book on the history of the idea of sin and how the metaphors for sin changed through the centuries in which the Old Testament books were written. So far, we've seen how he identifies the metaphors of sin as a burden and sin as a stain. But most of his book concerns the idea of sin as a debt. Without getting too far into the scholarly weeds, there was a sister language to Hebrew called Aramaic. In the centuries after the Babylonian exile, most Jews spoke Aramaic as their first language, leaving Hebrew primarily for priests and rabbis. The reason this is important is that when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Aramaic, the primary metaphor for sin as a burden became translated into Aramaic as sin as a debt. It's also important because Aramaic was the language of Jesus and his disciples. So when Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray in what we know as the Lord's Prayer, he teaches them in his native Aramaic, using the word for debt as the primary metaphor for sin. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us. That's the literal translation. But it's not only the Lord's Prayer. Notice how many times Jesus refers to debts as sin in his parables. For example, when Peter asks how often he has to forgive others, Jesus responds with a parable about a landowner who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. One of his servants approached him asking for time to repay. But when the landowner graciously gives him time, that same servant went out and demanded that another servant settle the debt he owed the first servant. But when the second servant also asked for time to repay, the first servant had the second one thrown into the debtor's prison. Jesus uses the image of sin as a debt to be repaid, even to talk about forgiveness. Then there's the parable of two servants who owe different amounts to their master. Jesus tells this parable to explain the actions of a prostitute who came in and washed his feet, while the Pharisees questioned why he would allow such a woman to even touch him. In response, Jesus tells the parable of two debtors, one who owes 500 denarii and one who owes 50. When they could not pay, says Jesus, the master canceled the debts for both of them. Now Jesus poses the question, which of them will love him more? The obvious answer is that the one who owed more will love more. His point, obviously, is that we are all sinners, including the Pharisees, but the sins of the prostitute seem greater than the more mundane sins of people like the Pharisees. And so when her sins, her greater sins, are forgiven, it stands to reason that she will be more grateful than they. We continue to use this metaphor in a variety of ways, even today. We say to someone who has done us a big favor, I owe you a debt of gratitude. We don't mean that we literally owe them some sum of money, only that we are extremely grateful. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that we actually owe them anything to reciprocate. Yes, we often try to do it kindness in return or send them a little gift, but it is not a debt in the legal, formal sense of the word. Theoretically, the same thing holds true for sins. We don't use the metaphor of sin as a debt in the formal legal sense of something someone can actually repay. But in the history of the faith, this metaphor did lead to that kind of legalism, a legalism that was perhaps not originally intended. What I mean is, people began to reason that if sin is a debt, then it stands to reason that it can be repaid like any other debt. And in what currency? In the currency of good works. When we return tomorrow, we'll explore how the metaphor of sin as a debt resulted in forms of what we have come to regard as works righteousness. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.